The tropics are quiet, but how long will it stay that way? The calendar turning over to July as we approach the busy months of hurricane season. What could the coming weeks bring us, and where does history suggest we might see tropical development? We are live, everybody, from your hurricane headquarters here on Track in the Tropics. Hey there, everybody. JB Buno down here in the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. On the top portion of your screen, we have WFLA meteorologist Julie Phillips and Ian Oliver. And in the bottom left, joining us once again, good friend of the program, WKRG chief meteorologist in Mobile, Alabama, Ed Bloodsworth. Great to have Ed back on the program. Everybody, we're going to be doing a hashtag-based Q&A here momentarily. So if you're joining us on social media, you see the hashtags on your screen. You can start to ask us questions. We'll catalog them here and ask them here after we get past the discussion here that we're about to have about the calendar turning over to July in the 2020 hurricane season. But if you have a question for one of our meteorologists, use the hashtag heyjulie, hashtag heyed, hashtag heyian, and we'll be plucking those comments, those questions out of the Facebook Live comment section and elsewhere on social media to pose them to our meteorologists here in about 5 minutes time. But the topic of conversation today, it is Wednesday, July 1st. We're getting closer to the peak of hurricane season. The tropics, quiet right now. Saharan dust might be playing a little bit of a factor on that. We'll be getting into Saharan dust, but I want to start with WFLA meteorologist Ian Oliver. Ian, we can't predict the future when it comes to weather, or we can, at least in the sort of not too distant future. But when we're looking at the calendar month of July, we don't know really what July is going to look like just yet. But we can go back to the history books and look a little bit more as to what July could look like based on previous months, previous Julys in recent hurricane seasons.
Of course, JB. History tells us a whole lot. Climatological history related to where these where these tropical systems develop each month of the year. We have all kinds of data during the satellite era, especially going back here. But yes, it's nice to have at least 1 month of hurricane season in the rearview mirror now. We've had 4 named storms. Thankfully, as we take a wide look at the Atlantic Basin, this is an infrared satellite, you see quiet conditions right now. We're not expecting any new systems to develop in the next 5 days. We've seen a couple of weak systems, 4 weak systems already now, but typically June and July, the early portion of the hurricane season, as we're talking about on average, very quiet periods as a representation, at least a fraction of the hurricane season. Typically in July, at least on record, less than 10% of hurricanes have formed in the month of July. It's typically when you get to August and September, you really start to see that uptick in tropical activity with the statistical peak of the season. That comes on September the 10th. So we expect quiet conditions in part because of what you described. We've had a lot of wind shear. We've had a very well-advertised, very dense plume of Saharan dust that made its way across the Atlantic. And there is more coming. We'll show you that in just a moment. But this is where we typically look to find tropical systems in the month of July. And Julie, as we're moving into kind of the midst of summer, we're just looking for warm water to help out with development.
Absolutely, yeah. We are looking for warm waters. I mean, typically this time of the year, we're really starting to see things cranking outside here at St. Pete. We already have those Gulf waters at 92 degrees. So they are really, really steamy at this point. As we do take a look for development, we're not quite tracking things usually moving across the, from Africa. That usually comes more in August when things start to heat up there. But we can still look for some development in the Gulf and then also for some development in the Western Atlantic too this time of year as those warm water temperatures really start to heat on up. So that's generally where we are looking at seeing some development. Like you mentioned, Ian, not that unusual to have things quiet right now for us. It's just that time of the season. We can get some early activity, and in June, that's usually common. We have some cold fronts that are still moving south, and we can get some lows that develop along those. But in general, again, it's really not until August where we really start to see things really ramping up. All right, Ian?
Ed, maybe
you've still got a little bit of that dust up by your way. We're taking a peek now at the current look at the Saharan air layer. That was something what we experienced last week. What are you guys seeing now?
Yeah, I was actually down there in Florida last week and kind of noticing those dusty, hazy skies. And this current plume of dust doesn't look to be quite as heavily concentrated as what we saw last week. However, we're starting to see it on our skies here in the Gulf Coast, Mobile, coastal Mississippi, coastal Florida, Northwest Florida as well. We're starting to see sort of that haziness to the sky. And when we look at these plumes of dust, on social media, there's been a lot of talk about these, and this is not unusual. We see this happen several times throughout the summer months, and typically would happen around this time. Usually June, July, we start to see these higher concentrations of dust. Once the monsoon season really starts to ramp up over Africa, that's when we start to see fewer plumes like this. But you can see there's another one, Central Atlantic, another one about to emerge off of Africa, and again, to see these make their way across the entire Atlantic is pretty something. I mean, last week's dust plume was one of the higher concentrations that we've seen in quite some time. But again, it causes some very dry air. Those who are sort of sensitive with some allergy issues, you may kind of notice that. But you'll notice there, as we go through the weekend, another plume goes through the Caribbean, starts to move into the Gulf, and that could certainly also have an impact. This dust, it has an impact on any tropical systems that try to develop, because, as you know, Ian, dust, dry air, and tropical systems do not mix very well.
No, they certainly do not. And that's actually kind of a nice segue to what we discussed last week, was what are the ingredients necessary to even get some of these tropical systems going. We talked about warm sea surface temperatures. We talked about low wind shear. You need a lot of moist air, a tropical atmosphere. We've been feeling it lately here with dew points around 80 degrees. And you need some area of low pressure, be it a tropical wave like we track in the main development region moving across the Atlantic, or like Julie mentioned, you can get upper level lows, you can get fronts that sneak into the Gulf that generate surface areas of low pressure. So we kind of wanted to build on the discussion last week, which was, where do we go from there? What happens? So the weakest of tropical cyclones, that's classified as a tropical depression. You've got storms, cloud showers, thunderstorms building around a well-defined center of circulation. That's what the National Hurricane Center is looking for to classify a system as purely tropical. It's that low-level center of circulation. You've got winds, moist air swirling in towards that center of circulation. So what happens from there, you've got warm and moist air. It rises and cools, and that water vapor that comes from all that evaporation off of the very warm sea surface temperatures, very warm ocean, which is why we see that uptick come August and September. That water vapor condenses into liquid water droplets. So it's a phase change from gas to liquid, and energy is released. That energy comes in the form of heat. It's called latent heat release. And that energy adds more heat, more instability, more rising air to the storm system. So you have air that's rising. You have more warm and muggy, very moist air rising in at the surface, and you're starting to generate what's called a heat engine. So a tropical storm, that's 39 to 73 miles per hour. Of course, if you continue to have conditions that are favorable for development, this whole system just keeps on intensifying, and it can happen quickly. Unfortunately, we've seen that with several systems over the last several years, very intense hurricanes we've had over the last few years. Hurricane, once you get to 74 miles per hour or better, you have very strong rising air near the center. That's when you can start to see an eye form. And then as hurricanes become more intense, once you get to Category 3 strength, that's what's considered a major hurricane. That's maximum sustained winds, 115 miles per hour or greater, which unfortunately we've seen several storms over the last several years with winds well in excess of that. Category 5 storms. We had Matthew, Irma, Maria, Michael, Dorian, and even Lorenzo in the eastern Atlantic. That's where you'll see a very well-defined eye feature develop, as you have the eye wall where the most intense rising motion is. You actually have some sinking, drier, stable air in the eye that allows the air to essentially clear out. And that's why when you take a top-down look from space, you can see that nice, well-defined eye. So that is the hurricane category. Julie, Ed, we've seen a lot of very powerful hurricanes over the last several seasons. The forecast has been for an above-average season. This year, we've got off to a fast start, but thankfully it's what we expect early in the season, very weak systems.
As we look here at the different categories of storm here, everybody, any other points from Julie or Ed before we open up the Q&A portion of our stream? Julie, Ed?
I would just say, this is kind of early in the season. So while we did have a few early season storms, it's not unusual to have this kind of lull late June into July. But now's a great time to get prepared, because by late August and September is typically, especially the last several years, when we've seen some of those major hurricanes develop.
And also, I would say, the NOAA and all the other organizations that put out these seasonal forecasts have all been in consensus with this being an above-average season. Again, getting off to this hot start, but we're still seeing some signs developing, in the Pacific and also into the Atlantic, where it looks like we're starting to see cooler waters off of the South American coast, perhaps a weak La Nina cycle starting to develop. And again, that typically leads to enhanced activity in the Atlantic basin. So again, late July, and then especially as we go into August and September is when we're going to have to watch things very, very closely across the Atlantic basin.
WKRG Chief Meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth, WFLA Meteorologist Julie Phillips, and Ian Oliver joining us here on Tracking the Tropics. I'm JB Buno, everybody. We're going to be opening up now the Meteorologist Q&A portion of our stream, which is where we're going to be taking questions from you at home. How this works, if you're new to Tracking the Tropics, use one of the hashtags that you have here on your screen. Hashtag Hey Ian, hashtag Hey Julie, hashtag Hey Ed, or hashtag Hey JB. But use the hashtags for our meteorologists. They're the ones that you really want to hear from here, everybody. And we'll be taking your questions out of the Facebook Live comment section and posing them to our meteorologists. So glad that you could spend part of your July 1st afternoon here with us. So we're going to be taking these questions, everybody, out of Facebook Live. And the first one comes from hashtag Hey Julie. Do you think that we're going to have a stronger season? This coming from Di Lynne French from WFLA's Facebook page here in Florida. Julie, we were just talking about this. DI is asking here, hashtag Hey Julie, do you think we're going to have a stronger season?
That has really been what pretty much everyone has been kind of thinking since the beginning. We've seen all signs pointing to a more active than normal season. Now, what's important to remember is the greater activity does not necessarily mean we'll have more landfalling events, but it would mean a greater chance, of course, of that if you do have more systems around. Like Ed had just mentioned, potentially with that potential of a La Nina developing, a La Nina weather pattern allows for more tropical systems to develop. The one thing that we have been seeing recently is some of that Saharan dust around that has been limiting activity, but that's probably not going to stick around throughout the course of the entire hurricane season. So right now it does look like the Colorado State forecast, NOAA's forecast, have all been pointing to a more active than normal season. So yes, we are still thinking that.
All right, the next question coming in, everybody, is from Veronica Arena from WFLA's Facebook page, again here in Florida, hashtag Hey Ian, asking, why is it so hot? Is there really climate change, or is it just hot? And maybe you can, talk about this a little bit here with Veronica, Ian, because we've had some scorching temperatures here to close out June and as we enter here July.
We're undoubtedly in a very, very warm period, and that has partially to do with the warming globe. But yes, if you look over the last 6-7 years, I believe 5 or 6 out of our last 7 years are warmest on record. And I was actually just trying to take a peek real quick. Of course, it's July 1st. The Weather Service puts out the climate summary for the month of June. And depending on where yesterday came in, we were likely in a top 5, top 6 warmest June on record here. And I'm assuming this came from Tampa Bay. It has been a relentless stretch here over the last several days, even the last 2 weeks here across Tampa Bay. That has a lot to do, especially coastal spots, with the lack of rainfall. We started off June with temperatures that were actually pretty reasonable. We had 6 inches of rain the first couple weeks of the month. And then through the last 16 days of June, we had no measurable rainfall at Tampa International Airport. And I don't want to say the word impossible, because we know in weather there's almost no such thing as impossible. But if you told me 16 straight days without measurable rainfall at Tampa International Airport in late June, I would give you any odds you wanted. That's a bet I want for sure. It was a wild period. And because of that, we've seen locally our Gulf temperatures up into the low 90s. We're 3 to 5 degrees or so above average for this time of the year. But if you look out in the Western Gulf, they've had a more tumultuous weather pattern, which is keep their waters a little bit more churned up. They're actually running a couple of degrees below average in terms of sea surface temperatures. But yes, we don't want to attribute any single weather event to climate change, the warming globe, this has been a very, very warm run across the Tampa Bay area, and you've seen what it's done to our waters locally. But you can't treat that's kind of like the window effect. You can't just look at our waters; they're above average. There are other areas that are actually trending slightly below. But yes, you're certainly got that observation correct. June was a top 5 likely warmest on record, and our Gulf waters locally are well above average.
As we look here at the tropical cyclone names for the 2020 Atlantic season, already getting Arthur, Bertha, Cristobal, and Dolly out of the way. Again, everybody, we are here live on Track in the Tropics doing a meteorologist Q&A. We've got about another 5 or 6 minutes or so to take your questions out of the Facebook Live comment section and pose them to our experts here, our meteorologists, who are so glad that you could spend part of your Wednesday afternoon here with us live on Track in the Tropics, streaming to apps, websites, and social media platforms. Let's get to the next question here, everybody, and it comes in from WKRG in Alabama, Janelle Lohman, for their chief meteorologist at WKRG, Ed Bloodsworth. Hashtag, hey, Ed, please explain the Saharan dust and storm development. So we're starting to get some questions here. I think the next question we have coming in here too, Ed, is about Saharan dust. So this is the question here that we have from Janelle.
Yeah, it's been the topic of a hot topic of discussion in the weather world for really the last couple of weeks as we've been seeing these plumes of Saharan dust. And basically, just to boil it down, we actually like to see dust across the Atlantic basin because it's very dry air. And dry air, especially when you start to get weak tropical waves that try to develop within a Saharan, a very dusty environment, it tends to try to pull in some of that dry air. Dry air is a very bad thing for strengthening tropical systems. Even in the case of mature hurricanes, they can have a significant impact and tend to either stop strengthening or help to weaken the storm. Any of that drier air that gets entrenched in these storms tend to sort of think of it as sort of chokes off the entire heat engine that Ian was mentioning a little bit earlier. So again, we start to see these plumes that come off, especially early in the season. Several more are still sitting out there in the Atlantic. So, normally we don't even really look at the coast of Africa or the Cape Verde Islands for development. Still, we have to wait until August before we look that far out into the Atlantic. But any of these little tropical waves that we've been noticing near the Windward and Leeward Islands, even a couple of them that have been trying to develop in the Caribbean, right now, there's so much wind shear, and then there's a ton of dust. So that's leading to this very unfavorable environment currently across the Atlantic basin. So as for us meteorologists who work on coastal locations, the more dust that we like to see, the better.
And the next question that we have is also regarding Saharan dust. I'm going to pose this one to WFLA meteorologist Julie Phillips. And Julie, it's coming in from RJ Williams from WMBB's Facebook page. That's on the Florida Panhandle. That's Panama City Beach, for those of you unfamiliar with the lay of the land here in Florida. Julie, does the Saharan dust make the air temperature hotter?
So we did have a good bit of Saharan dust here in the Tampa Bay area this past weekend, and you've probably been noticing we have been warmer than normal. So there's kind of 2 things that go along with it. One, like Ian was talking about, we haven't seen much rain. So because we haven't seen the typical rain that we would see in the Tampa Bay area, that has allowed our temperatures just to continue to rise each day. We don't have as much cloud cover around. Also, the drier air. Drier air does heat up faster than humid air. So that's something to consider as well. So especially in our case, the last week or so, the Saharan dust, I do think, was a factor in us seeing warmer temperatures than we otherwise would have been seeing. Again, partially because it heats up a little bit faster, and then also because it limited the amount of rain that we had here in our area.
Again, as we look here at the Saharan dust, everybody in the center of your screen. Guys, some of the questions that we ask you from our Facebook Live viewers, sometimes are a little bit easier to answer. Sometimes they're a little bit more difficult to answer. I think that this one for Ian might be a little bit more of a curveball, but Ian, maybe you can answer this question coming in here, and I'll make sure I have the right question loaded up here. Yeah, it is. It's from Barbie Fowler at Barbie Fowler Newsom from WSAV Savannah, Georgia, joining us. Hashtag, hey, Ian, if storms get bad, I'm concerned about how evacuations are going to work with COVID. Not sure you even have an answer to that. Are we looking at some higher landfall, higher cat hurricanes? Is the question here from Barbie. Ian.
Okay, well, there's certainly a degree of hope in here, because when we issue a seasonal forecast, when we see seasonal forecasts issued by the number of bodies that do it, including NOAA, that's for a number of what they're expecting systems to develop. That does not say anything about whether any of these systems are going to make landfall. We've seen 4 named storms already, minimal impacts from all 4. So we've had very, very active seasons without a storm that makes landfall, and we've had seasons that weren't very active, and then unfortunately we see a landfalling system and we see the impacts related to that. Of course, we don't want to double up on the struggles that we're going through. We have one catastrophe that we're dealing with, sadly, in the form of this pandemic that we've been dealing with over the last several months. Of course, we don't want to introduce another large-scale evacuation or something like that. Logistically, there are many, many issues that I don't even want to speculate. Emergency managers, that is their job, and I'm sure they're all putting protocols in place should these plans have to be put into effect. I'm sure that would involve as much mask wearing and social distancing as possible in an event like this. From a meteorological standpoint, we're hoping we track a number of these systems because we know conditions are going to be fairly favorable for development, especially once we get into the teeth of the season, August and September, to see many systems develop. But it's just going to be like any other season. We're watching, we're tracking these very closely, and we're also hoping that none come near us or anywhere across the United States, anywhere across the tropics. We need storms to develop in open water, take the heat that they acquire in open water, and take it up towards the North Pole. We've got a nice big ocean for that, the Atlantic Ocean. Hopefully that's where they stay, and we don't have to start answering or addressing those kinds of questions, JB.
Yeah, things are quiet right now, and we can only hope that they remain that way for as long as possible. We will absolutely be seeing more named storms over the course of the hurricane season, but we want them to be on the lower end, not on the higher end, of course. The final question that we're going to be taking here, everybody, from Facebook Live, it's an easier question, and I'm going to pose it to WKRG Chief Meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth. It comes from Brittanie Burns in Arkansas, joining us from KARK's Facebook page in Arkansas. This is as simple of a question as it gets. Ed, we'll leave this here with you. Anything forming now?
No. That's as simple as the answer. It's the simplest question that we've gotten so far today. But yeah, I mean, it's early in the season, as Julie and Ian have been kind of really hitting on here. June and July normally are not very active months in the Atlantic Basin, and especially right now, again, with all this dust out there, a lot of wind shear as well. Fast-moving winds in the upper atmosphere for the Caribbean portions of the Atlantic, and that's really kind of preventing most of these tropical waves from developing in any kind of significant way. So no development over the next 5 days expected. Again, once we get beyond that, we'll be keeping our eyes on things. One thing I actually did want to mention that we were regarding last question regarding the pandemic. One thing that we've heard a lot from our emergency managers is that folks who normally having like an evacuation plan or a shelter in mind for their plan should they need to, that really should not be your first resort, especially this year. This is affecting a lot of the ways that we're preparing to evacuate. It also should change how what you put in terms of your disaster supply kit. Hand sanitizer, masks, wipes, and things like that. But a lot of our emergency managers have been telling people and really hitting the point that you really need to have a plan. If you need to evacuate, a shelter should be your absolute last resort. Get in touch with friends, family, and have that plan ready to go now, so you'll know exactly what you need to do if that decision were to be needed to be made, that you would need to evacuate. So again, this pandemic affecting all of our lives, upending everything, and it's affecting the way that we need to prepare this season as well.
And our hurricane guides, as a reminder, are on our respective websites. Be sure to check those out. And everybody, we got to wrap up here on Tracking the Tropics. Can't thank WKRG Chief Meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth joining us from Mobile, Alabama, and WFLA meteorologist Julie Phillips and Ian Oliver joining us from home. Social distancing to the extreme. We're here live from our hurricane headquarters in the bottom right-hand portion of your screen, but spread out here across the southeastern United States and the other areas of your screen with the meteorologists that are joining us, Julie, Ed, and Ian. We are back on Wednesday, next Wednesday, 2 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central, unless there is tropical development that you need to know about. As Ed said, quiet over the next 5 days, but if anything happens, you'll hear it here live, everybody, on Tracking the Tropics, streaming to the app, website, or social media platform in the palm of the hand, wherever you are. So stream